I'm Candace Fuller, 32, and my parents actually scoffed when I walked into that courtroom. Not quietly either. It was the kind of look people give when they think the ending is already written and all that's left is watching you lose in public. My father leaned back like he was bored before the hearing had even started. My mother wouldn't even look at me for more than a second at a time, which somehow felt worse. And my uncle gave this slow little shake of his head, like I was still the same girl they used to dismiss whenever family money came up, like I had wandered into a fight that was already bigger than me. They had spent weeks building that version of me for the court, the greedy granddaughter, the convenient caregiver, the woman who got too close to an old man at exactly the right time. They thought I'd walk in nervous, overwhelmed, maybe even ashamed. What they didn't know was that I had spent most of my adult life staring at people who lied for a living and still thought they could look calm while doing it. So when I took my seat and set my hands in my lap, I didn't look at them again. I looked at the bench. That's when everything shifted. The judge glanced down at the file, then back up at me, and I watched the change hit his face in real time. Not confusion, recognition. Sharp, immediate recognition. He studied me for a second longer than he should have, then looked back at the paperwork like he needed to make sure he had read it correctly. The room went strangely still after that, and for the first time that morning, my parents stopped looking so certain. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A few months earlier, my grandfather Walter Gaines was still the fixed point in my life, the one person who had never once made me wonder where I stood. I grew up in his house in Baton Rouge with my grandmother, Ruth Gaines, and for most of my childhood, that house felt steadier than anything connected to my actual parents. My mother, Patricia Fuller, had me young, then spent years acting like adulthood had happened to her unfairly. My father, Dennis Fuller, moved through jobs, plans, and excuses with the same restless energy, always sounding like he was one good break away from finally becoming reliable. Neither of them ever fully disappeared. They drifted in often enough to remind me they existed, then vanished again before their presence could mean anything. Grandma made that house feel certain. She believed most problems looked smaller after a meal and a clean counter. Grandpa was different. He ran Gaines Industrial Maintenance for decades, and everything about him reflected that life. He liked schedules, receipts, labeled folders, locked file drawers, and people who said what they meant. He was not soft in the obvious way, but he was the one who showed up. He was at school meetings, doctor appointments, and parent nights that should have belonged to somebody else. He never made me feel like I was the burden that had created our arrangement. My earliest memory of Patricia is not one big scene. It is a series of fragments that all carry the same feeling. Perfume in the doorway, sunglasses still on indoors, a rushed hug that landed somewhere near my shoulder, her checking the time before she sat down. Dennis was even less defined in my mind when I was little. I mostly knew him through brief visits, missed promises, and the sound of him explaining why something had come up again. By the time I was old enough to understand patterns, I had already stopped measuring love by what people said they meant to do. I measured it by who actually came through the front door when it mattered. My Uncle Mark Gaines fit into that same lesson, just in a different way. He was my grandfather's son, my mother's younger brother, and the kind of man who could walk into a room looking wronged before anyone had asked a question. Mark always had a project that had gone sideways, a payment that needed covering, a partner who had betrayed him, a tax problem that was somehow never his fault. He came by with folders under his arm and left calmer than he arrived. I was old enough to notice that he almost never showed up empty-handed unless he planned to leave with something. Nobody in that house had to explain the family hierarchy to me. I learned it by watching. Patricia called when she needed sympathy or money. Dennis surfaced when she wanted backup, or when staying visible for a holiday looked easier than being judged for missing it. Mark appeared whenever his life started wobbling and he needed Grandpa to steady it for him. Then there was me, the child they all treated as if I were temporary right up until the years made that lie impossible to maintain. The strange part was that I did not grow up feeling unwanted inside Grandpa's house. I grew up feeling sharply aware of who had chosen me and who had not. Grandma softened all of it while she was alive. She never pushed me to chase Patricia, and she never lied in a way that insulted my intelligence. She would redirect, make dinner, hand me something to do, and let disappointment pass through the room without becoming the center of it. Grandpa handled it differently. He kept score privately. I did not know how carefully back then, but I could see enough to understand that he noticed everything. Every no-show, every request, every sudden burst of family concern that lined up with a financial problem. By the time I reached my 20s, the truth about my family no longer felt confusing. Patricia and Dennis were the people who gave me my face and my last name. Grandpa and Grandma were the people who gave me a life. Mark was part of the bloodline, but not the part that ever held anything together. Baton Rouge is full of people who can look respectable from the outside while everything under the surface runs on favors, silence, and old money cleaning up new mistakes. My family was not powerful enough to make headlines, but it worked on the same principle. The people who caused the mess were rarely the people left standing in it. That role usually belonged to Grandpa. And because I lived in his house long enough to see how often he paid for other people's failures, I understood exactly why the air changed whenever money entered the room. Years made the arrangement look normal from the outside, but it never really was. By the time I finished college and started building a life of my own, Grandma Ruth had already been gone for several years, and that house on the quiet stretch of Baton Rouge felt different without her in it. It was still clean, still orderly, still run on habit and routine, but the warmth had changed shape. Grandpa Walter kept moving the way men like him always do after a loss that should have slowed them down. He went into the office less, stayed home more, and started paying closer attention to things most people ignored. Repair bills, account statements, property taxes, vendor contracts. The kind of paper trail that only matters if you believe one day somebody will try to challenge what really happened. I did not move back in, but I was there constantly. I stopped by after work, brought groceries when he pretended he did not need help, sat at his kitchen table while he sorted envelopes into neat stacks, and listened when he wanted to complain about the way people got careless with responsibility once they thought someone else would clean it up. We did not have sentimental conversations very often. That was never our style. What we had was consistency, the kind that stops needing to announce itself. If his porch light was on, I parked in the side drive and let myself in. If I was running late, I called. If he had a doctor appointment, I knew about it before the reminder card reached the mail. Nobody asked me to do any of that. I did it because he had done the same kind of ordinary, unglamorous showing up for me my entire life. Patricia noticed just enough to resent it without ever offering to replace it. Dennis stayed detached in the way men do when they think distance keeps them from being judged. Mark was more irritating than either of them because he moved in and out of the picture with the confidence of someone who believed blood excused everything. He would disappear for months, then turn up in Grandpa's driveway with a serious face and some new crisis balanced under his arm. A dispute with a supplier. A loan payment that had tightened around his neck. A piece of equipment for a failing contract job that had to be replaced right away. He always sounded temporary, like the problem would be solved by one more check, one more signature, one more favor from the man he still called Dad whenever he needed something softened. I did not know the numbers then, not the full ones. but I knew enough to understand that Grandpa had spent decades propping up people who never confused his generosity with permission to stop disappointing him. The last year of his life made all of that harder to ignore. He was still sharp, still himself, but age had started taking its share in slower mornings and longer recoveries after simple things. He hated being watched too closely, hated repeating himself, hated any suggestion that he was becoming fragile. So I learned how to help without making it feel like help. I filled his freezer. I brought folders from the office he said he was too busy to retrieve. I sat through meetings with contractors when he wanted a second set of ears but refused to call it that. Somewhere in that stretch of time, Janice LeBlanc became a more regular presence in the house. She had handled legal work for Grandpa for years, and I knew her as the kind of woman who wore practical shoes, carried too many folders, and never wasted a sentence. At first, I assumed she was there over routine business. Grandpa was always adjusting something, renewing something, reviewing something. He believed paperwork should be finished before emotions got involved. I never asked for details, and he never volunteered them. Looking back, that was probably deliberate. He did not want gratitude tied to expectation. And he definitely did not want money turning the relationship between us into something smaller than what it had always been. The day he died was quiet, which somehow made it worse. No emergency room panic, no dramatic phone call, no final speech that would have looked meaningful from the outside and hollowed me out later. He died in his own home after a stretch of declining energy that had made me uneasy without giving me a clear line to fear. I was the one who handled most of what came next, because that was simply the truth of our family by then. I met with the funeral home, sorted documents, answered calls, signed what needed signing, and watched Patricia and Dennis slide into the process with the careful grief of people who knew how to look appropriate when other people were watching. Mark showed up with the same expression he always wore when money and death appeared in the same week. Not openly greedy, not openly grieving either, just alert in a way that made me tired on sight. The service itself was large enough to make something plain that none of them had ever fully understood. Grandpa had built a real life. Men from the company came, former clients came, neighbors came, people who had known him for 30 years came. He had helped more people than he ever talked about, and they stood there remembering him as a serious man with exact standards and a quiet sense of fairness. Patricia cried in the right places. Dennis looked solemn. Mark shook hands and acted like proximity could substitute for devotion. I stayed busy because stillness would have made the whole thing harder to survive. A week later, I sat in Janice LeBlanc's office expecting a straightforward review of personal items. Maybe the house, maybe a few structured distributions, maybe something set aside for each of them out of obligation, if nothing else. That was the version I assumed made sense, not because I thought it was fair, but because family messes usually hide inside compromise. Instead, Janice opened a folder, adjusted her glasses, and explained that Grandpa had amended almost everything long before his health had started slipping. The house, the investment accounts, the business proceeds, the rental properties, the cash reserves, all of it had been placed under a structure that left primary control to me. Not shared, not divided 4 ways. Me. Patricia went still in a way I had never seen before, as if shock had stripped even her performance instincts. Dennis looked angry almost immediately, the kind of anger men reach for when humiliation lands before they have language for it. Mark leaned forward first, then back, like his body could not decide whether to attack or calculate. Janice kept speaking because that was her job, explaining documents, dates, revisions, signatures, witnesses, all of it orderly and dry and impossible to argue with in that room. Then she placed a second set of files on the table and said Grandpa had instructed her to preserve supporting records in case anyone ever tried to contest his wishes. That was the moment the air changed. Not because I understood everything in those files yet, but because Mark did. I saw it in his face before he covered it. Whatever he thought would happen after Walter Gaines died, it was not this. 2 weeks later, I got served at work. There is something uniquely insulting about being handed a stack of papers in the middle of an ordinary day and realizing your own family has found a legal way to turn history into fiction. I took the envelope back to my office, shut the door, and read every page without moving anything on my desk. Patricia and Dennis were named as the plaintiffs. Mark was not listed in the caption, but his fingerprints were all over the language. I knew that before I reached the second page. The petition painted me as calculated, opportunistic, and strategically devoted. It said I had inserted myself into Walter Gaines's final years, isolated him from his family, controlled access to the house, influenced his legal decisions, and used his declining condition to position myself as the sole beneficiary of an estate that should have remained within the immediate family line. It was hard not to appreciate the cruelty of that phrasing, immediate family line, as if I had been living in somebody else's home by accident for 3 decades, as if I had appeared near the end like a thief instead of growing up in that kitchen, sleeping in that back bedroom, and learning to sort receipts at the same table where my grandfather taught me long division. The worst part was not the greed. I expected that. The worst part was how cleanly they had stripped the truth out of the story and replaced it with something that sounded just plausible enough to survive first contact with a courtroom. By then, I had spent years working as a senior investigator on financial exploitation cases involving vulnerable adults, probate fraud, forged transfers, coerced signatures, quiet theft by relatives who suddenly became attentive the moment an older person's assets looked easier to reach. I knew exactly how these cases were built, how they sounded when the facts were weak, and the emotional framing had to do the heavy lifting. That may have been why reading my own name in that petition made me feel cold instead of shaken. I recognized the mechanics immediately. They were not just contesting documents. They were trying to manufacture a pattern that had never existed and erase the one that had. I called Elaine Mercer before I called anyone else. She came recommended by Janice LeBlanc, and by the end of our first meeting, I understood why. Elaine was the kind of attorney who never wasted time pretending outrage was strategy. She read fast, marked quietly, and only asked questions when she wanted an answer precise enough to use later. She looked through the filing once, set it down, and said the plaintiffs were relying on 3 ideas: that Walter lacked full capacity near the end, that I exercised undue influence over him, and that ordinary caregiving had created an opportunity for manipulation. Then she looked at me and said the case would stand or fall on records, routines, and credibility. That was the first useful sentence anyone had spoken to me since the petition arrived. I gave her everything I already had access to: calendars, appointment cards, maintenance invoices, copies of emails, funeral paperwork, and the early set of documents Janice had preserved. Janice added the more important layer over the next several days. She pulled trust amendments, execution dates, witness confirmations, memo summaries, correspondence about revisions, and a set of internal notes Walter had insisted be kept with the estate file. He had not written some grand emotional defense of me. That would have been too sentimental for him, and too easy for the other side to dismiss as the product of hurt feelings. What he had done instead was far more like him. He had documented patterns, dates of support, transfers to Patricia, emergency funds advanced to Mark, extra payments made on his behalf when one mess bled into another, notes on attempted visits that turned into cancellations, copies of requests for money that arrived dressed up as concern. I sat in Janice's office one afternoon while she laid those materials out in measured stacks, and for the first time I realized how long my grandfather had expected this fight. Not hoped for it, not invited it, expected it. He had known exactly who his death would reveal. That understanding did something permanent to me. It burned away the last weak hope that this was all happening because grief had made everyone irrational. Grief was not inventing this. Greed was. Elaine also wanted a complete picture of my role in Walter's life without letting the case drift into sentimentality. That mattered because affection alone proves very little in court. Routine proves much more. So we built the timeline the way I would have built one in my own work. My phone records showed regular calls. Emails confirmed appointment coordination. Delivery records matched the groceries I brought. Visitor logs from the gate camera showed how often I came by compared with how rarely anyone else did, unless money or paperwork was involved. There were home repair authorizations Walter had signed after I helped schedule contractors, medication pickup records, and a trail of practical, boring details that no manipulator would ever think to invent over years because they are too repetitive to fake convincingly. Somewhere in the middle of that process, Elaine asked about my work, not because she needed my resume, but because she wanted to understand whether it would matter to the judge once the case was assigned. I told her what I actually did: case reviews, witness development, records tracing, elder exploitation referrals, civil support on suspicious transfers, the kind of work that forces you to notice when concern appears only after a bank account gets large enough to matter. She gave me a look that was not quite amusement and not quite warning, then said that if the assigned judge had ever seen my name professionally, the irony of this petition would not be lost on him. She was right. Baton Rouge is not a small town, but the legal world is still full of repeated names, familiar filings, and people who remember who is usually standing on which side of a pattern. By the time the hearing date was set, I was no longer angry in the loose, chaotic way I had been when the papers first arrived. Anger had narrowed into attention. Patricia and Dennis had signed onto a lie because it offered them one more shot at money they had never earned. Mark had fed that lie because he thought he understood how family weakness could be turned into leverage. Elaine was preparing to answer them with documents. Janice was organizing the record the way Walter would have wanted it: clean, exact, and impossible to sentimentalize. And I was getting ready to sit in a courtroom while strangers reviewed the difference between people who claimed a title and people who had actually lived it. By the time the hearing began, they looked more confident than grieving. Patricia had dressed to look subdued and sympathetic. Dennis carried himself like he was offended to even be there. Mark looked the calmest, which made sense because he was the one who believed this case could still be turned into money. Their attorney, Paul Doherty, opened carefully. He described Walter Gaines as an aging man made vulnerable by grief, routine dependence, and too much access from the one person who was always around. That person, of course, was me. He framed Patricia and Dennis as flawed but concerned parents, and he framed me as the granddaughter who had become too involved at exactly the right time. Patricia testified first. She said her father had always been controlling, that he judged her harshly when she was young, and that I had made the distance between them worse by becoming too central in his life. She did not try to sound perfect. She tried to sound wounded, which was smarter. Elaine let her settle into that version of herself, then started pulling the record apart. Years of financial support, missed visits, canceled plans, messages that sounded caring until they turned into requests for money. Patricia kept reaching for vague explanations, but the paperwork kept dragging her back to specifics, and specifics had never been kind to her. Dennis did no better. He wanted the court to believe Walter had disliked him unfairly and had kept him at a distance, but there was no real pattern of fatherly effort on his side to point to. Elaine moved him from general claims to actual moments, and he had almost nothing. No steady presence, no real involvement in my life, no evidence that he had tried to remain close to Walter unless Patricia was already involved. He got irritated fast, and once he did, the image he wanted to project started slipping. Mark was the most controlled witness, and also the most dangerous one. He tried to present himself as the son who understood Walter's business, his responsibilities, and the estate itself. He suggested I had made myself indispensable in Walter's final years and had used that role to influence the outcome. That was the strongest version of their case because it leaned on one thing that was true. I had been there constantly. But Mark counted on the court confusing presence with manipulation. Elaine answered him with records, loans, bridge payments, emergency help. Money Walter had advanced over and over to keep Mark's problems from getting worse. Then she moved to the practical record, gate logs, calendars, service appointments, all of it showing how little Mark had actually been around unless something in his own life was falling apart. By the time he stepped down, their case no longer looked like a fight over fairness. It looked like three people trying to turn years of absence into a legal right. When my name was called, I stood up feeling more tired than nervous. I had spent the whole day listening to people who had barely lived my life try to explain it as if they knew it better than I did. Elaine kept my testimony simple. She asked for the structure of my life, and I gave it to the court plainly. I said I had been raised in Walter Gaines's house for as long as I could remember any stable version of family. Ruth Gaines made that house feel warm. Walter made it feel secure. Together they did the work my parents never stayed long enough to do. Patricia and Dennis were never completely gone, but they were never the people I counted on. They appeared when visibility mattered, then disappeared again before their presence meant anything. By the time I was old enough to notice patterns, I already knew who showed up consistently and who didn't. I explained that after Grandma Ruth died, I did not suddenly take over Walter's life. I simply continued being there in the same way I always had, more often, more practically, because he was older and alone. I brought groceries, handled small tasks, coordinated appointments when needed, and stayed close because he was family in the only way that had ever truly mattered to me. I also made clear that I never once asked him what I was getting, never pushed him to discuss his estate, and never tried to steer him toward any decision. That idea only made sense to people who believed everyone else thought about money the way they did. On cross-examination, Paul tried to turn routine into control and access into influence. He suggested my professional background had made me especially capable of shaping Walter's decisions without leaving obvious evidence, but the record worked against him. If I had wanted secrecy, I would not have left behind years of ordinary, consistent documentation. If I had wanted money, I would have needed to know what I was aiming for, and I did not. Janice LeBlanc confirmed that Walter had revised his trust gradually, knowingly, and with full clarity. She told the court he had preserved supporting records because he was methodical, and because he understood his family well enough to expect a challenge. Teresa Boudreau followed with the kind of testimony that mattered because it was simple and neutral. She had seen who came around regularly, who helped, who checked in, and who only surfaced when there was a problem attached. Then the records came in, service logs, payment histories, entry reports, and the long trail of financial support Walter had given Patricia and Mark over the years. After that, the case stopped looking like a dispute over a vulnerable old man. It looked like what it really was, an attempt to make years of absence sound like entitlement. When the judge came back, the room felt tighter. Judge Harold Boudreau looked over the file one last time and began in the measured tone people use when one side is about to lose the story it has been clinging to. He said the issue was whether Walter Gaines had understood his own decisions and made them freely. Then he moved through the record. Janice LeBlanc had established an estate plan built over time. The documents matched Walter's habits, not sudden confusion. The financial records showed support flowing from him to Patricia and Mark for years, not pressure from me toward him. The practical records showed presence where it mattered and absence where it was easiest. He found no credible basis to set aside Walter's estate plan. He found no persuasive evidence of diminished capacity. He found no proof that my involvement in Walter's daily life had crossed the line from family support into undue influence. The structure Walter created stood as written. Then he added the part Patricia had probably never imagined hearing in open court. The plaintiffs had pursued a claim the record did not support, and because of that, they would bear the legal consequences that followed. It was formal, final, and entered into the record. Patricia lost whatever color she had left in her face. Dennis went still when anger and embarrassment hit him at once. Mark did not look shocked so much as exposed. For the first time since Walter died, he looked like a man forced to see himself without the language he had always used to soften his failures. Elaine touched my arm once, then started gathering papers. I stayed seated for a few extra seconds, because my body had not caught up with the fact that it was over. What happened outside the courtroom mattered more to me than the ruling itself. Patricia followed me into the hallway with the kind of urgency she had never brought to any school event or ordinary day of my childhood. She wanted one more chance to frame the whole thing as a misunderstanding big enough to survive. I did not argue with her. I told her the truth as plainly as I could. She had spent my life treating motherhood like a title she could set down and pick up again whenever it suited her. The court had ruled on the estate, but the rest had been decided years earlier by choices no judge had forced her to make. Dennis tried to step in, then stopped when he realized there was nothing left for him to defend except his own absence. Mark said almost nothing. The months after the case were quieter than I expected. Elaine helped me send formal notice that all future contact about the estate had to go through counsel. I changed the gate codes at the house, updated account controls, and moved Walter's properties into a tighter structure that did not depend on goodwill. Patricia stopped trying to sound maternal once she understood that tone no longer opened anything. Dennis faded back into the edge of my life where he had always been most comfortable. Mark had a rougher landing. Discovery had dragged more of his financial dependence into the light, and some of the business relationships he relied on cooled once people saw how much of his stability had always rested on someone else's money. None of that felt like revenge to me. It felt like consequence. I went back to work, and that was the strangest part. My days filled again with other families, other records, and other attempts to make exploitation sound like concern. But something had changed in me. I stopped confusing restraint with obligation. I stopped treating access as something people deserved because they could point to shared blood. Walter had spent his life helping people who mistook rescue for a permanent right. Love can be generous without being blind. Family can be real without being biological. And a boundary can be honest even when other people call it cold. That is the only thing I would want anyone listening to this story to carry with them. The people who show up steadily matter more than the people who appear loudly. Titles do not prove love. History does not erase neglect. Protecting your peace is not cruelty when the truth has already been clear for years. I did not walk away from a family. I walked away from a pattern that had asked me to accept less than the truth and call it loyalty. Walter and Ruth gave me something better than money. They gave me a working definition of love. It is reliable. It is visible. It takes responsibility. Everything else is just language. If this story made you think about the difference between blood and loyalty, or about the people who truly showed up in your life, thank you for staying with me through it. I appreciate you listening.